8-year-old Emma Martinez pressed her small face against the cold hospital window, watching the gray London morning unfold below. Her bald head caught the pale sunlight streaming through the glass, and she traced patterns on the foggy window with her finger. The chemotherapy had taken her beautiful brown curls 3 months ago, but it couldn't take away the sparkle in her dark eyes. "Mama, when can we go see the palace?" Emma asked, turning to her mother who sat quietly in the uncomfortable hospital chair. Maria Martinez looked up from the medical paperwork scattered across her lap, her tired eyes softening as she looked at her daughter. "Soon, mi amor. The doctor said maybe next week if your blood counts improve," Maria replied, though uncertainty clouded her voice. They had traveled from their small apartment in Manchester to London for Emma's specialized cancer treatment at Great Ormond Street Hospital. The little girl had been dreaming of seeing Buckingham Palace since arriving in the capital city 2 weeks ago. Emma had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia 6 months earlier. What started as unusual tiredness and bruises had quickly turned into a nightmare that flipped their world upside down. The single mother had quit her job at the textile factory to care for Emma full-time, and their savings were rapidly disappearing, despite the support from the National Health Service. The hospital room felt smaller each day, filled with beeping machines, IV poles, and the constant smell of antiseptic. Emma's favorite stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hopscotch, sat on the bedside table, wearing a tiny knitted hat that matched the colorful beanie Emma wore to keep her head warm. The hat had been a gift from the hospital's children's charity, along with coloring books and crayons that now lay scattered across her bed. Dr. Sarah Thompson knocked gently on the door before entering with her usual warm smile. She had become like family to Emma and Maria over the past weeks, always taking extra time to explain things in ways Emma could understand, and checking on Maria's well-being too. "Good morning, sunshine," Dr. Thompson said, pulling up a chair beside Emma's bed. "I have some good news today. Your latest blood work shows improvement, and I think we might be able to arrange a special outing for you soon." Emma's face lit, up like a Christmas tree. "Really? Can we go see the soldiers with the big fuzzy hats? And the palace where the Queen lives?" Dr. Thompson chuckled at Emma's enthusiasm. "Well, the Queen actually lives at Windsor Castle now, but yes, we can definitely arrange for you to see the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace. There's a wonderful charity that helps children like you have special experiences during treatment." Maria felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her daughter's joy. These small moments of happiness had become precious treasures during their difficult journey. Emma clapped her hands together, then immediately asked if Mr. Hopscotch could come along to meet the royal guards. That afternoon, Emma spent hours drawing pictures of guards in red uniforms and tall black hats. She colored carefully with her crayons, making sure each guard looked perfect. Her small hands moved slowly because the treatment made her tired, but she didn't stop until she had created a whole army of colorful guards across several pieces of paper. "I'm going to give these to the real guards," Emma announced proudly, holding up her artwork. "Maybe they'll put them on the palace walls." Maria smiled through her worry, knowing how important these dreams had become to Emma. The little girl talked constantly about the brave soldiers who protected the palace, imagining them as heroes from her favorite storybooks. She had even started practicing walking like a soldier, taking careful marching steps around her hospital room when she had enough energy. As evening fell over London, Emma fell asleep, clutching one of her guard drawings. Maria sat beside her bed, gently stroking her daughter's forehead and whispering prayers for strength. Outside the window, the city lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere across those lights stood Buckingham Palace with its famous guards. Neither Emma nor Maria could have imagined that within days one of those very guards would change their lives forever, with a simple but extraordinary act of kindness. The stage was set for a moment that would touch hearts around the world, all beginning with a little girl's dream to meet the soldiers who guard the palace. The hospital room grew quiet except for the steady rhythm of Emma's breathing and the distant sounds of London traffic. Tomorrow would bring another day of treatment, but tonight, Emma dreamed of red uniforms and tall black hats, completely unaware that her courage was about to inspire one of the most heartwarming gestures ever witnessed at the gates of Buckingham Palace. 3 days later, Maria helped Emma into her warmest clothes for their special trip to Buckingham Palace. The little girl had chosen her favorite purple sweater and the rainbow-colored beanie that the hospital volunteers had knitted for her. She carefully tucked her drawings of the royal guards into a small backpack, along with Mr. Hopscotch, who was wearing his matching tiny hat. The charity volunteer, Mrs. Rachel Chen, arrived at the hospital with a genuine smile and boundless energy. She had been organizing special outings for sick children for over 15 years and had a natural gift for making each child feel like royalty. Mrs. Chen had arranged for a comfortable taxi and timed their visit perfectly to coincide with the famous changing of the guard ceremony. As their taxi wound through London's busy streets, Emma pressed her face to the window, watching the city come alive around them. She pointed excitedly at red double-decker buses and asked questions about every building they passed. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and even Maria found herself smiling more than she had in weeks. "Tell me about the guards, Mrs. Chen," Emma requested, settling back in her seat with Mr. Hopscotch on her lap. "Are they really as tall as giants? Do they ever smile?" Mrs. Chen launched into colorful stories about the Queen's Guard, explaining how they trained for months to stand perfectly, still and protect the royal family. She told Emma about their bearskin hats, which aren't really made from bears anymore but from synthetic materials, and how the guards must follow strict rules while on duty. When Buckingham Palace finally came into view, Emma gasped audibly. The grand facade with its ornate gates and Victoria Memorial stood majestically against the cloudy London sky. Crowds of tourists were already gathering for the ceremony, phones and cameras ready to capture the spectacle. Mrs. Chen had secured them, a perfect viewing spot near the palace gates, close enough for Emma to see the intricate details of the guards' uniforms. The little girl stood on her tiptoes, clutching the iron railings with excitement. Other tourists noticed her obvious enthusiasm and began making space for her to get a better view. The ceremony began with the sound of military music echoing across the palace grounds. Emma watched in absolute wonder as the guards marched in perfect formation, their red tunics bright against the gray morning and their bearskin hats adding impressive height to their already tall frames. The precision of their movements mesmerized her, and she stood completely still, not wanting to miss a single moment. Among the guards was Sergeant James Mitchell, a 28-year-old soldier who had been serving with the Coldstream Guards for 6 years. He had participated in hundreds of these ceremonies, but today something felt different. As he marched past the crowds, his trained eyes automatically scanned the faces watching from behind the gates, a habit developed from years of security awareness. That's when he noticed Emma. Her small face peered through the railings, eyes wide with amazement and joy. What struck him most wasn't just her obvious delight, but the colorful beanie covering her bald head and the way she gripped Mr. Hopscotch tightly against her chest. Having grown up with a younger sister who had battled childhood illness, Sergeant Mitchell recognized the telltale signs of a child undergoing medical treatment. The ceremony continued with its traditional pomp and circumstance. Emma watched every movement, every turn, every salute with the intensity of someone witnessing magic. When the guards took their positions for the formal inspection, she whispered to her mother about how brave and strong they looked. "Mama, they're like superheroes, but real ones," Emma said softly, her voice filled with awe. Maria felt her heart swell with emotion watching her daughter's happiness. For these precious moments, Emma wasn't thinking about hospitals or treatments or feeling sick. She was simply a little girl experiencing something wonderful, and that was worth more than all the medicine in the world. As the ceremony concluded and tourists began to disperse, Emma remained pressed against the gates, hoping for one more glimpse of the guards. She pulled out her carefully drawn pictures, looking at them and then at the real guards, amazed at how close her artwork had come to capturing their magnificence. Sergeant Mitchell, now in his stationary guard position, found his gaze returning to the little girl at the gates. Something about her courage and joy in the face of what was clearly a difficult battle moved him deeply. As he stood at attention, he began forming an idea that would soon create one of the most touching moments in the palace's recent history. The seeds of an extraordinary gesture were already taking root in the heart of a soldier who understood that sometimes the most powerful acts of kindness come from the most unexpected places. Emma lingered at the palace gates long after most tourists had wandered away. She couldn't tear herself away from watching Sergeant Mitchell, who now stood perfectly still in his sentry position. The little girl studied every detail of his uniform, from the gleaming buttons on his red tunic to the impressive bearskin hat that made him appear almost 8 feet tall. "Mrs. Chen, why don't the guards ever move or smile?" Emma whispered, though she was speaking loud enough for people nearby to hear. Her innocent curiosity brought gentle smiles to the faces of other visitors who had noticed her fascination. Mrs. Chen knelt beside Emma, explaining in simple terms about duty and discipline. "They're protecting something very important, sweetheart. Sometimes being brave means standing very still and watching over others, even when it's hard or boring." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her 8-year-old mind. She had spent many hours lying very still in hospital beds while doctors worked to help her, so perhaps she understood better than most what it meant to be brave in quiet ways. Meanwhile, behind his stoic expression, Sergeant Mitchell was deeply moved by the little girl's continued presence. He had been trained never to break character during duty, but his heart was stirring with an unusual warmth. He could see Emma showing her drawings to her mother and Mrs. Chen, pointing excitedly between her artwork and his uniform. Maria noticed Emma's energy beginning to fade, a common occurrence since the chemotherapy treatments had started. The little girl's shoulders drooped slightly and she leaned more heavily against the palace railings. Despite her exhaustion, Emma refused to leave, insisting she wanted to stay until the guard's duty shift ended. "Just a few more minutes, Mama." "Please?" Emma pleaded, her voice carrying that special tone children use when something matters deeply to them. An elderly tourist standing nearby overheard their conversation and approached Maria with a kind smile. Margaret Thornberry was a retired teacher from Yorkshire who had been visiting London with her granddaughter. She had been watching Emma's interaction with the guards and was touched by the little girl's obvious wonder. "Excuse me, dear," Mrs. Thornberry said gently to Maria. "I couldn't help but notice your daughter's fascination with the guards. My granddaughter and I were planning to wait for the next ceremony, too. Perhaps the girls could keep each other company." Maria gratefully accepted the kind offer. Mrs. Thornberry's 12-year-old granddaughter, Sophie, immediately took Emma under her wing, sharing stories about London and pointing out details about the palace architecture. The two girls formed an instant friendship, with Sophie patiently answering Emma's endless questions about everything she could see. As they chatted, Emma pulled out her drawings and showed them proudly to Sophie and Mrs. Thornberry. The artwork clearly showed a child's interpretation of the royal guards, complete with oversized hats and bright red uniforms. Each drawing was signed with Emma's careful handwriting. "For the brave guards at the palace." "These are absolutely wonderful," Mrs. Thornberry said genuinely. "Have you thought about giving one to an actual guard?" Emma's eyes widened with excitement and nervousness. "Could I really do that? Would they be allowed to take it?" Sophie, with the confidence that comes with being 12, declared that of course the guards would love to receive such beautiful artwork. She suggested they ask Mrs. Chen if it would be possible to somehow deliver one of Emma's drawings to the guards. Mrs. Chen thought carefully about the request. She knew the strict protocol surrounding the Queen's Guard, but she also understood how much this meant to Emma. After consulting with a nearby palace security officer, she learned that while direct interaction with guards on duty wasn't permitted, there were appropriate channels for delivering items to the guards' barracks. However, as they discussed these logistics, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Sergeant Mitchell had been observing this entire interaction from his position, and his military training in reading situations told him that this little girl was fighting a much bigger battle than anyone around her realized. During his years of service, Sergeant Mitchell had learned that true courage comes in many forms. He had seen it on training grounds and during ceremonial duties, but he was witnessing a different kind of bravery in Emma's determined presence at the palace gates, despite her obvious physical challenges. As his guard duty neared its end, Sergeant Mitchell made a decision that would break protocol in the most beautiful way possible. He began forming a plan that would transform a routine day at Buckingham Palace into a moment that would be remembered forever, not just by Emma and her family, but by people around the world who would soon hear this remarkable story. The stage was set for an act of kindness that would prove sometimes the most powerful gestures come from stepping outside the rules in service of something greater than duty itself. As Sergeant Mitchell's guard duty approached its end, he made a decision that would change everything. Breaking from his rigid military posture for the first time that day, he slowly walked toward the palace gates where Emma still stood with her mother and new friends. The crowd of remaining tourists noticed immediately that something unusual was happening. Emma looked up in complete amazement as the tall guard approached her position at the railings. Her small hands gripped the iron bars tighter, and she whispered, "Mama, is he coming to talk to us?" What happened next would be captured by dozens of phones and cameras from tourists who instinctively knew they were witnessing something special. Sergeant Mitchell stopped directly in front of Emma, his impressive height making the little girl crane her neck to look up at him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other through the palace gates. Then, in a gesture that seemed to move, in slow motion, Sergeant Mitchell carefully removed his iconic bearskin hat. The crowd around them fell completely silent, understanding that they were watching something unprecedented. Guards simply didn't break protocol like this, especially not during active duty at Buckingham Palace. With gentle precision, Sergeant Mitchell lowered the hat until it was level with Emma's face at the railings. The bearskin hat, which had seemed so imposing and formal moments before, now became a bridge between a soldier and a little girl fighting her own brave battle. Emma's reaction was immediate and pure. Her face lit up with a joy so radiant that several onlookers felt tears spring to their eyes. She reached through the railings with small, careful hands to touch the famous hat that she had admired from a distance. Her fingers traced the soft, synthetic fur with wonder, as if she were touching something magical. "It's so soft," Emma whispered, her voice filled with awe. "And it's really yours?" Sergeant Mitchell nodded, maintaining his serious expression but allowing the smallest hint of warmth to enter his eyes. He had broken one of the most fundamental rules of Royal Guard protocol, but in that moment, he knew it was absolutely the right thing to do. Maria stood frozen, her hand covering her mouth as she watched her daughter experience something that would stay with her forever. Mrs. Chen quickly understood the significance of what was happening and began quietly explaining to other tourists that this was an extraordinary gesture, not something that ever happened during normal palace operations. Emma carefully pulled out one of her guard drawings from her backpack. With Sophie's encouragement, she held it up to show Sergeant Mitchell. The drawing depicted a smiling guard in a red uniform with an oversized bearskin hat, and across the bottom Emma had written in her careful child's handwriting, "Thank you for being brave." The moment grew even more touching when Emma, with the innocence that only children possess, asked if she could try wearing the hat. The request was impossible due to the physical barriers of the palace gates and security protocols, but Sergeant Mitchell's response would become the defining moment of this entire encounter. Without hesitation, he placed his bearskin hat on top of his head in the traditional position, but then he did something that made everyone around them gasp softly. He removed his distinctive red tunic jacket and, reaching through the palace railings as far as security would allow, he handed it toward Emma. The gesture was symbolic rather than practical since Emma couldn't actually wear the jacket, but the meaning was crystal clear to everyone present. This royal guard was sharing a piece of his uniform, his identity, and his respect with a little girl who had captured his heart through her courage and joy. Emma accepted the gesture by reaching through the rails to touch the red fabric of his jacket. Her small hands felt the texture of the wool and the weight of the military buttons. For a few precious seconds, she was connected to the world she had been dreaming about since arriving in London. The crowd of tourists had grown larger as word spread through social media that something remarkable was happening at the palace gates. Videos were already being shared with captions like, "Royal Guard breaks protocol for sick child," and "the most beautiful thing you'll see today." But for Emma, none of the attention mattered. She was lost in the magic of the moment, talking softly to Sergeant Mitchell about her drawings, her stuffed rabbit Mr. Hopscotch, and how she had dreamed of meeting a real royal guard. Although he remained largely silent due to his training, His gentle nods and the obvious care in his movements spoke volumes about the connection forming between them. As palace security began to approach, recognizing that the situation needed to be managed carefully, both Emma and Sergeant Mitchell seemed to understand that their extraordinary moment was drawing to a close. What neither of them knew was that this simple act of kindness was about to spread around the world, touching millions of hearts and creating a story that would be remembered long after both of them had returned to their daily battles. Within hours of the encounter at Buckingham Palace, videos and photos of Sergeant Mitchell's gesture began spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. The hashtag, Joss Royal Guard Kindness, started trending on Twitter, and Facebook posts sharing the story were being liked and shared thousands of times every minute. Back at Great Ormond Street Hospital, Emma couldn't stop talking about her amazing day. She sat in her hospital bed, carefully arranging her drawings while recounting every detail of meeting the real Royal Guard to anyone who would listen. Nurses, doctors, and other patients' families gathered around to hear her excited storytelling. "And then he took off his big fuzzy hat and let me touch it through the fence," Emma explained to Dr. Thompson, her eyes sparkling with the memory. "And he looked at my drawings and I think he really liked them because he nodded like this," she demonstrated with a serious nod that made everyone in the room smile. Dr. Thompson was amazed by the positive change in Emma's demeanor since the palace visit. The little girl seemed more energetic and optimistic than she had been in weeks. This kind of emotional boost often had real medical benefits for pediatric patients, and Dr. Thompson made notes about incorporating more positive experiences into Emma's treatment plan. Meanwhile, across London, Sergeant Mitchell was dealing with the unexpected consequences of his spontaneous act of kindness. His commanding officers had called him in for a meeting to discuss the breach of protocol. While some might have expected disciplinary action, the response was surprisingly supportive. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had served with the Coldstream Guards for over 20 years, sat across from Sergeant Mitchell in his office. The walls were lined with photographs documenting decades of royal ceremonies and military traditions. "Mitchell, what you did today was highly irregular," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison began, his expression serious but not unkind. "The Queen's Guard has protocols for very good reasons, and breaking them is not something we take lightly." Sergeant Mitchell straightened in his chair, prepared to accept whatever consequences his actions might bring. He had no regrets about helping Emma, but he understood the importance of military discipline and tradition. "However," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison continued, "sometimes extraordinary circumstances call for extraordinary responses. We've been monitoring the public reaction to your gesture, and I think you should see this." He turned his computer screen toward Sergeant Mitchell, showing him the flood of positive responses flooding social media. Messages of support were pouring in from around the world, with people praising not just his kindness, but the values he represented as a member of the British military. Comments ranged from heartfelt personal stories about children fighting cancer to expressions of pride in the Royal Guard's humanity. Parents shared photos of their own sick children inspired by Emma's courage, and former military personnel wrote about how Sergeant Mitchell's actions embodied the true spirit of service. One particularly moving post came from a military family in Canada, whose daughter had lost her battle with leukemia the previous year. They wrote about how seeing kindness triumph over rigid rules gave them hope that their daughter's memory would inspire others to choose compassion over convention. The story had also caught the attention of major news outlets. BBC News was preparing a feature story, and Good Morning America had reached out for interviews. The Palace press office was fielding calls from international media wanting to know more about the Guard, who had touched hearts worldwide. But perhaps most surprisingly, a message had come from members of the royal family themselves. While Palace protocol prevented direct communication, word had filtered down through official channels that the gesture had been noted at the highest levels and was viewed favorably as representing the best traditions of service to others. Back at the hospital, Emma's story was having ripple effects throughout the pediatric ward. Other children undergoing treatment were drawing their own pictures of royal guards, inspired by Emma's artwork and her brave day at the palace. The hospital's art therapy program coordinator asked if they could display Emma's original drawings in the children's recreation area. Mrs. Chen from the charity organization was fielding calls from other hospitals and children's organizations, asking how they might arrange similar experiences for the young patients in their care. The power of one authentic moment of connection was creating possibilities for countless other children facing their own difficult battles. Emma's mother, Maria, found herself overwhelmed by the attention, but grateful for the joy it had brought her daughter. Local newspapers wanted interviews, and strangers were stopping her on the street to tell her how inspiring Emma's story was to their own families. As Emma drifted off to sleep that night, clutching Mr. Hopscotch and surrounded by her royal guard, drawings, she had no idea that her simple dream of meeting a palace guard had touched people in countries she had never heard of. Her courage in the face of illness, combined with one soldier's willingness to break rules for the right reasons, had created something much larger than either of them had imagined possible. 3 weeks after the encounter at Buckingham Palace, Emma received a package that would complete her incredible journey in the most unexpected way. The official royal crest on the envelope made Maria's hands tremble as she carefully opened it. In Emma's hospital room, with Dr. Thompson and several nurses gathered around to witness the moment. Inside was a handwritten letter on official palace stationery, along with something that made Emma gasp with pure delight. The letter was from Sergeant Mitchell himself, approved through proper channels and written in careful, kind words that Emma could understand. "Dear Emma," the letter began, "your drawings of the Royal Guards were the most beautiful artwork I have ever received. Your courage and joy reminded me why we serve, and I wanted you to have something special to remember our meeting." Wrapped carefully in tissue paper was a miniature replica of a Coldstream Guard's bearskin hat, sized perfectly for Mr. Hopscotch. But even more amazing was what came with it: an official certificate making Mr. Hopscotch an honorary member of the Queen's Guard, complete with tiny printed credentials and a small red ribbon. Emma's reaction was everything her mother had hoped for and more. She immediately placed the tiny hat on Mr. Hopscotch's head and began marching around her hospital room, declaring that now she had her very own royal guard to protect her during treatment. The story continued to spread globally, with updates about Emma's progress and her special delivery making headlines in dozens of countries. The British Embassy and various nations reported receiving letters from children who had been inspired by Emma's story to face their own challenges with greater courage. A children's book publisher reached out to Maria about turning Emma's drawings and story into a picture book, with proceeds benefiting pediatric cancer research. Television producers wanted to create a documentary about the power of small acts of kindness during difficult times, but the most meaningful development came from an unexpected source. Other members of the Queen's Guard began a quiet tradition of carrying small drawings or letters from sick children during their ceremonial duties. The practice wasn't officially sanctioned, but commanding officers chose to look the other way as long as it didn't interfere with their primary responsibilities. Sergeant Mitchell found himself becoming an unofficial ambassador for the human side of military service. He began visiting children's hospitals during his off-duty time, always in civilian clothes, bringing coloring books featuring royal guards and sharing stories about palace life that delighted young patients. Emma's health journey continued with its ups and downs, but her spirits remained remarkably high. During difficult treatment days, she would tell doctors and nurses about her royal guard friend and show them pictures of Mr. Hopscotch in his tiny bearskin hat. The story became a source of strength not just for Emma, but for her medical team, who drew inspiration from her resilience. 6 months later, Emma was finally declared to be in remission. The day she rang the hospital's traditional bell to celebrate the end of her treatment, she wore her colorful beanie and held Mr. Hopscotch in his guard hat. Maria shared a video of the moment on social media, thanking everyone who had supported them through their journey. The video reached Sergeant Mitchell, who by then had been promoted and was serving in a training role with new recruits. He showed the video to young soldiers as an example of how their service could impact lives in ways they might never expect. Emma's courage, he told them, had taught him more about real bravery than years of military training. A year after their first meeting, Emma and her mother returned to Buckingham Palace. This time, Emma wore a new hat she had knitted herself, and her hair had grown back in soft brown curls. She brought fresh drawings of royal guards to add to the collection she had started, each one more detailed and confident than her earlier artwork. Sergeant Mitchell wasn't on duty that day, But word of Emma's return had reached the guards currently stationed at the palace. During the changing of the guard ceremony, something unprecedented happened. As the guards marched past the gates, one of them caught Emma's eye and gave her the smallest, most subtle nod of recognition. Emma beamed with joy, understanding that she had become part of something larger than herself. Her story had reminded people around the world that kindness doesn't require grand gestures, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we choose compassion over convention. The little girl who had once pressed her face against hospital windows, dreaming of meeting a royal guard, had discovered something more valuable than she had ever imagined. She had learned that real magic happens when brave people recognize bravery in each other, and that healing can come from the most unexpected places. As Emma and Maria walked away from Buckingham Palace that day, Mr. Hopscotch rode proudly in, Emma's backpack still wearing his tiny bearskin hat. Behind them, the palace gates stood as they always had, but for everyone who knew their story, those gates would forever represent the place where protocol gave way to humanity, and where one small act of kindness had touched hearts everywhere.